What's good, YouTube? It's me, boy Squiddy, back again with another video. So today I wanted to talk about how to hand trap against Kashtira. So I'm gonna make like a quick video series about how to hand trap against the different decks, because I know there are a lot of hand traps out there, and yeah, a lot of decks play them. So it's always good to know how to optimally activate your hand traps against a certain deck, and it's not always obvious. It does depend on a lot of different factors. So starting off, Kashtira, obviously this is a deck that locks you down. Either they have a plethora of plays, but generally they focus on using their effects to banish your cards face down, whether that's from the field, deck, and sometimes other parts of the game as well, including the graveyard and the hand. But generally, they put up a Walking Macrocosmos in the form of Kashtira A-Rise Heart that also has the effect where it can detach 3 materials to target any card on the field and banish it face down. And then they can do that using their regular monsters like Kashtira Unicorn, Kashtira Fenrir, which are the 2 main ones. And they also have a couple of other extenders as well that allow them to either get 3 level 7s on the board or 2 level 7s so they can make Shangri-La, activate the effect of Rise Heart to banish 3 cards from your opponent's deck face down, and then overlay a Rise Heart for free on top of any Kashtira monster. So generally, the hand traps are actually not super great against this deck, first and foremost, because of the fact that everything's sort of at full power right now. We have 3 of every card, and the deck is just hyper consistent. They also get to play between 3 or 5 pots, so Prosperity or Desires, so they can just turbo into the cards that they need in order to make the same plays. And it's a little scary because the deck can do a couple of different things. They can obviously just go on Rise Heart and pass. They can go on double Rise Heart and pass as well if they have a monster extender with Unicorn. Or they can even lock up to 5 zones using Shangri-La or 2 copies of Shangri-La, which is pretty annoying. So you never really know which hand traps decide against them or which will work effectively. But let's quickly talk about the hand traps that are actually prevalent in a lot of decks and a lot of main decks in the format that you just might have going against Kashtira, let's say in a game 1 or a game 2 after you side. First and foremost, Ash Blossom. So this is like the most popular generic hand trap that's in basically everyone's deck. I see a lot of people using this card kind of bad against the Kashtira deck. It's a little hard to say when you should exactly Ash Blossom. It does depend on a number of different factors, like how they're sequencing their plays. The first thing that is easily ashable that comes to mind is obviously Kashtiosis. So this is one of the, I would say, almost like the bottlenecks of their plays. If you can stop this, sometimes it just passes their turn. This targets a Kashtira monster that they control and special summons a Kashtira monster with a different attribute from their deck in defense mode. So obviously this is one thing that you generally want to ash. What you don't really want to ash is something like a Unicorn or a Fenrir, because if they happen to have Kashtiosis in their hand, then you just basically went -1 for the Ash Blossom. They're able to activate the Kashtiosis and then special summon and continue to do their plays. That would only mean that they lose access to Birth if they didn't happen to have that as well. So it's not very good to ash the Unicorn or the Fenrir, in my opinion, unless they're like down to 1 card. I really like to ash the Kashtiosis. And then another thing that I think is actually potentially correct is ashing the field spell, Pressured Planet Rathos. So from a glance, it seems kind of bad to ash this card, but because of the fact that a lot of people are actually main decking Droll and Lockbird, a lot of the better players are actually playing around Droll and Lockbird. So if they opened the field spell and a monster, they would probably special summon the monster first and then use the effect to add something before activating the field spell. Because if you happen to have Droll, that means that they're getting a free +1 value from the monster instead of activating Rathos and getting Drolled right away, where they kind of go a little bit nag because they used the Rathos to add a monster. So they're still sitting at 5 cards in hand and they're not getting up to free +1. Whereas if they had the monster, they get a free +1, so they have 5 in hand plus a monster on the field, so they have 6 cards in terms of advantage. And the other thing is the players might choose to activate like Unicorn first to add Kashtiosis or Birth to their hand. So if you have Droll, then they can still continue to do their play and make a Rise Heart. Whereas if they activated Rathos first, it means that they would not be able to potentially get enough bodies on board to make a Rise Heart play, which is what they want to end on generally. So all of that in mind, if they activate Rathos as their first action, I would say 9 times out of 10, that means that they probably don't have a monster or another play, and they're banking on the Rathos resolving in order to start their play. And I noticed that throughout the YCS 250th in LA that I actually asked this card a couple of times, and it actually, like, they passed their turn because a lot of the better players were playing Droll. So if they go, like, special summon Unicorn, they would add, like, Kashtiosis, and then they if I droll there, they would later they told me like after the game that they had Rathos, or like if I didn't have droll, they would just activate Rathos after, right? So I found that was really, really interesting. So I actually think that ashing on Rathos is potentially correct as well as Teosis. So I'd say those are your two best bets. The other thing is you should definitely ash for when they pot a pros for 6 as their first action, because that means that they might be digging for their play as well. If they had a hand that was a little bit better, they probably would just hold the pot of prosperity until the very end after they make a rise heart, so they can attach the fusion monsters that they banish for free off of pot of prosperity, like Aurora or something, so they get extra advantage, right? If their rise heart leaves the table, they get to draw a card. So yeah, that's Ash. Moving on, Impermanence. So this card's not very good against the Kashtira deck. It does depend on the type of deck you're playing as well. If you're playing a deck like Tearlaments where you have to bank on using the graveyard, you might want to just hold Infinite Impermanence for your turn until they make the Rise Heart, and then use it on the Rise Heart to guarantee that you're able to play, right? Because decks like that, is as long as you're able to play with your graveyard, you're probably in a good spot. But if you waste your Imperm on something like a Kashtira Unicorn or a Kashtira Fenrir, then they might have other extenders in their hand and then continue to be able to make a Rise Heart. So you sort of look at your Imperm and it's like, oh, I kind of went neg on that because I used it on Unicorn, right? So I don't really like using this on Unicorn or Fenrir if it's your only hand trap, right? So it depends. Obviously, if you're playing a grave deck, sometimes I might hold it. The other thing is that if it's your only hand trap, I don't like using it on the monsters because 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to have another extender, right? Everything's at 3. We have 3 Pot of Prosperity as well. They can just dig for Castiosis, Kashtira Birth, or another piece. So it's not very good to use it right away on the Unicorn or the Fenrir, in my opinion. But that being said, it depends on what the Kashtira player does as well. If they're going for the lock 3 and they go and summon the Diablosis, this might be another bottleneck that you can actually imperm. So if you use the imperm on Diablosis there, they're not able to lock 2 additional zones because of the fact that they would not be able to banish cards face down from your deck and extra deck, so Shangri-La would miss the triggers for the 2 consecutive activations. And it also protects your extra deck. If you're playing a deck like a fusion deck where you're kind of banking on keeping your extra deck, this helps a lot. It guarantees that you get to keep it, and it guarantees that the chances are they're not going to be able to lock you for 5 either, because you've held the imperm to that point where it actually hits Diablosis, which is the key card. And you get rewarded a lot more if they're actually going for the lock 5, because they're going to have to make the Shangri-La before committing to the Diablosis, because they would have to use both copies of Shangri-La to lock 4 zones, right? So if they have Diablosis on the field and you imperm there, that gives you a lot of value because you stop that, and they've kind of invested their entire hand into that play. So I generally like to hold imperm if it's your only hand trap. But if you have 2 hand traps, including imperm, sometimes you might, depending on what the other hand trap is, if it's like a high impact card, you might want to just imperm the Unicorn or the maybe even the Fenrir. So that way you have like a fallback. You have a second hand trap to guarantee if they have a following extender, you can still protect against that and then play on your turn. So it really depends. But I think trying to hold the imperm if your deck is really reliant on the graveyard is really important, and then potentially doing it on the Diablosis if your opponent is actually going for that lock. Moving on to Nibiru. So this card is obviously pretty easy to play. I see a lot of players just using it right away, like on the Diablosis summon, and I think that could be correct if your extra deck, again, is like really, really diversified. If you're playing something like Tearlaments where you really need like a Zeus or you need the Mud Dragon for your super poly plays, maybe you could just Nibiru on that. The only thing is that this could backfire if their hand is good and they have Birth. They could still follow up and potentially even make another Rise Heart, right? So it's kind of like it depends on, like, you have to make the read and see what your opponent has based on their sequencing. I generally like holding Nibiru until the very end of their plays just to see what they do. So if they Rise Heart Pass, obviously it's dead. But I'm saying if they go for the lock 3 and then maybe they overextend as well, they activate Birth and they try to special summon the Fenrir just for an added layer of interruption, you could just wait until the end of the turn. They do all that, you Nibiru end of main phase, and then they lose everything. Whereas if you Nibiru early, they can either potentially make another Rise Heart if their hand's good enough, or they can actually activate Birth and special summon back Fenrir, which happens quite often. So then you still have to kind of deal with the Fenrir on the table, and that's not always the easiest, especially if they have like hand traps or if they have ways to stop you from playing on your turn, if they have like a shifter, for example. So I do like holding Nibiru, but it does depend on the deck that you're playing. Ghost Mourner, this card, obviously, I think the best time, it's a lot like Impermanence because it does negate like a monster effect. The best time to use it is again dependent on your hand, but you could use it on the Unicorn or the Fenrir right away, which is quite handy a lot of times because you're not going to be able to use the banish effect as well. It's basically a Veiler. The only problem with this is you have to preemptively drop it before they use the effect, right? It's not like Imperm or Veiler where you can chain to their effect. So this could potentially backfire if they have Birth or another way to get another copy of a Unicorn or a Fenrir on the table, which is actually quite easy because they have Kashtira's, Kashtira Birth. Then they could use that second copy's effect because they have not attempted to use the effect, right? You just negated the monster's effect preemptively before they use the effect to search. So they would be able to accrue that advantage in a later, different body. Later in that turn. So that's why I don't really like always using it on the monsters as well. You could, again, hold this for Diablosis if they're going for the lock, but then you get kind of punished if they are going for the Arise Heart pass because of the fact that it's not like Imperm where you can just use it on your turn whenever you want. You have to use it when your opponent summons a monster by special summon. So that being said, I actually think I like using the Mourner on the body that they special summon first, so the Unicorn or the Fenrir. You kind of have to concede to the fact that if their hand is good, they're probably going to be able to get another copy of Unicorn or Fenrir and then use the effect to search. But this combined with other hand traps, sometimes it's enough to stop them. So I would use this on the first body that they summon. Moving on, speaking of another powerful hand trap is PSY-FRAMEGEAR Gamma. So this is a very, very powerful card, and this is very, very especially powerful against Arise Heart because of the fact that Arise Heart is actually a mandatory effect that triggers each time a card is banished. That means you can easily trigger Gamma to your liking. So if you have a Gamma in hand, one thing you could do is potentially hold it until your turn. They make the Arise Heart, and then on your turn, you can do something cool like activate any spell card. So let's say you activate like a Pot of Prosperity. And then on the new chain, Arise Heart's going to trigger as a mandatory chain link 1, and then you can Gamma here. So this is really nice with Prosperity because you can activate Prosperity, potentially add a copy of Gamma, and then on the new trigger of Arise Heart, you can use the freshly added Gamma to negate and destroy it and special summon a driver from your deck. So that's a really nice thing you could do. But if they're going for like the lock 5, sometimes they might lock your monster zones, so you can't really use Gamma in that case. So it depends on what your opponent does. If they're doing something like in game 1, game 2, they locked you, you might even want to use it on one of the first monsters. So on Unicorn or on Fenrir. And then sometimes that will actually pass their turn because of the fact that they lose the body as well. So they're not able to use Kashtira. But if a good player is playing this deck and they have Kashtira and a monster, they're probably going to special summon the monster, activate Kashtira first to play around the Gamma, right? So if they're using the effect, they might just not have an extender. You could Gamma there and just destroy and potentially end their turn as well. But clearing their board is kind of dicey as well because they might just have another copy of a Unicorn or a Fenrir and they can continue to play using other cards in their hand. But it really depends on your hand. If you're playing a deck that doesn't really care about the graveyard, I would probably use the Gamma on the first body that they summon, like Unicorn or Fenrir, just so they don't get massive advantage. But if you're playing a deck where you have to get a Rise Heart off the table, then you might consider holding Gamma and then using it on your turn to guarantee that it's off the table and to guarantee the fact that you get 2 bodies, right? Like if you're playing Kashtira and you play Gamma, you can't really do much with the 2 bodies because you probably don't play Synchro monsters. But if you're playing a deck like Tearlaments or some other deck where you can link off, you can synchro and do a lot of cool stuff with these 2 bodies, then you might want to hold it on your turn as well. Droll and Awkward, so this is a no-brainer. This is just like you should shotgun this on the first ad that they do because a lot of times it can't actually pass their turn if their hand is fragile and they're not able to play around Droll. But again, good players are definitely playing around Droll and Awkward. They're summoning their monsters first, using it to add Kashtira, Kashtira Birth first before committing to their plays. So Droll and Awkward is definitely not as good against the deck, but if you do happen to main deck it, then obviously use it against the first thing that comes up. Ghost Spell is obviously hideous against this deck. The only thing I think it really hits is Scareclaw Kashtira and then maybe Kashtira Birth as well, I believe. So it's definitely not a card that you should be side decking. If you happen to be main decking it for whatever reason, those are just 2 cards that you can hit. I think probably the only 2. And you are able to use it on Kashtira Birth even if they don't have a Kashtira monster in the graveyard because of the fact that the game recognizes potentially on resolution there could be a Kashtira monster that goes to the graveyard. If they went like Kashtira Burst, Chain Link 1, Chain Link 2, Twin Twisters, discard a Kashtira, right? So the game allows you to Ghost Spell even though there's no Kashtira monster in the graveyard because of the fact that it says special summon from the grave or the banished pile and it checks on resolution. And then the last one I kind of had here was Artifact Lancea. So this card is all right against the deck. I wouldn't say it's spectacular, but if I was playing this card in my side deck, I would probably just shotgun it because of the fact that the pot cards exist. We don't want them to prosper for 6. We don't want them to desires and draw 2, especially in game 2, game 3, where they might be siding counter sides to your deck. So we don't want to have them get the opportunity to be able to draw those cards. We just want to Lancea right away. I know a lot of players are kind of waiting for this, for something like a Cosmic Cyclone to chain to, or to even wait until the opponent commits. Like they go like Unicorn and Phantomer and then special summon Riseheart and make Shangri-La. But I just like the Lancea right away. So we're treating this hand trap a lot like a turn skip. We don't really want to treat it as a 1-for-1 value. It's a lot similar to Droll Knockbird, where it's just a blanket. We're going -1 for the chance that our opponent just skips their turn and then is not able to make a Riseheart or just makes a weaker board, right? So I would just use this right away so they cannot Pot of Prosperity or Pot of Desires. And yeah, that's about all I had. If you guys have any other questions about hand traps or stuff, definitely let me know in the comments below. Or if any tips, anything I missed here, let me know below. And if you haven't subscribed and rated, comment already, please do so. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.